Disclaimer here, I'm neither a professional author nor a teacher. I'm just an amateur writer whose purposes in making videos are to share ideas and observations which will hopefully inspire you. I'm just saying this now so that you don't go into this video expecting some elaborate, well-polished presentation that will magically grant you the power to write a bestseller. Now that we've got that squared away, let's get into today's topic. Today's topic is the somewhat curiously named Grimdark Fantasy. For those of you that don't know what this is, Grimdark Fantasy is basically a subcategory of fantasy that is characterized by three things: realism, nihilism, and a dystopian setting. Now, to give you an idea of just how integral each of these things are in the structuring of the framework of a grimdark narrative, and also how it is that these things distinguish grimdark fantasy from other types of fantasy, I'm going to break down the aforementioned terms individually. Artistically, realism is defined as the theory or practice of fidelity in art and literature to nature or to real life and to accurate representation without idealization. Put simply, realism in this context is the belief that art should replicate life or reality as accurately and identically as possible without putting any interpretations or idealizations into it. Realist paintings, for example, favor precision and duplication of their subject matter down to the last detail. They strive for nothing less than exactness in their depictions of scale, light, structures, basically any aspect of whatever it is they choose to replicate on a canvas. Unlike such idealistic painters as the Romantics, the realists have no interest in the abstract or mythological aspects of art, nor do they do things like personify emotions or phenomena. Bear in mind, I am not saying that realism is by any means dull or that it lacks imagination. You really only have to look at a realist painting to see the level of artistic discipline and appreciation of beauty that goes into the realist way of life. Realism is not the same thing as cynicism, and it certainly is not exclusive to the kind of dark thematic elements that characterize grimdark fantasy, but hopefully you can see that realism, like pretty much any movement in art, is not merely a technique for creating paintings. It is a worldview which looks at life frankly and directly, not necessarily pessimistically, but not always optimistically either. So the question remains, how can realism be an element of fantasy? And isn't the entire fantasy genre more or less at odds with the realist perspective? The answer is actually yes. Realism in the sense of the historical movements that I've been talking about is at odds with fantasy. Fantasy is defined as the faculty or activity of imagining things, especially things that are impossible or improbable. In other words, fantasy is literally unrealistic. So how is this radical difference reconciled in grimdark fantasy? The answer is that the realism utilized in said fantasy is not exactly the same as the literary realist movements of the 19th century. The key difference here lies in the extent to which realist principles are applied. Like I said before, literary and artistic realism was not merely a doctrine on how to create art, it was an entire way of life which sought to evaluate the world a certain way. However, realism in the context of grimdark is nowhere near as all-encompassing as this. Instead, grimdark is realistic in one aspect in particular, its view of human nature. You see, some of the key details which distinguish a grimdark narrative are the way in which the characters work, how they act, how they think, how they operate under pressure, things like that. For example, there is often a general atmosphere of dishonor, and more often than not, the heroes or protagonists of the story have prominent moral flaws. In many ways, grimdark fantasy is actually one of the most interesting types of fantasy, because the characters involved, or at least the key characters involved, are almost always multidimensional. Do you get the picture? Essentially, grimdark fantasy is characterized by realism, but realism applied only in the creation and treatment of the characters rather than the overall setting. It is in this way that a story can have both realistic elements and fantastic elements. Next, we have nihilism. This is a term that is rather hard to define, at least within the context of art, for reasons which will probably make themselves self-evident. Nihilism, in the philosophical sense, is simply the belief that life has no meaning. Extreme nihilism takes this a step further and holds the belief that nothing in the real world has a real existence. In fact, the word nihilism itself comes from the Latin word nihil, which literally means nothing. So, nihilism, or nihilism, is quite literally primarily the belief that there is nothing. In order to understand how nihilism influences art, however, we need to take a look at a nihilistic storyteller and try to understand their thought process so that we can better understand their message. For this, we are going to take a look at one of the most prominent nihilist writers of the 20th century, Franz Kafka. For those of you that don't know who he is, Franz Kafka was a bohemian novelist who also wrote short stories, many of which are renowned for their surreal and absurdist subjects. Most people don't typically think of him when they think of influential modern writers, but he's a well-known figure, particularly within literary circles. He was called the Dante of the 20th century by poet W.H. Auden, and his name was even listed as one of the greatest writers of his time by novelist Vladimir Nabokov. In fact, the term Kafkaesque is still used to this day to describe a story which features the kinds of fantastic and often nightmarish elements that were present in Kafka's stories. But even though many of Kafka's writings were commonly considered horror, many of the elements and settings featured in his stories were nihilistic, which is why I'm focusing on him here. For the purposes of this analysis section, I'm going to focus on just one of his most famous short stories, Metamorphosis. Now, if you haven't read Metamorphosis, I'm going to get into some spoilers, so if you want to read the book yourself, which I highly recommend, just skip to this slide. Metamorphosis, or Die Verwandlung, tells the story of a man named Gregor Samsa, a salesman who lives with his family and is pretty much the household's primary source of income. The story begins with Samsa waking up one morning to discover that he has been transformed into a gigantic insect. Neither the protagonist nor the reader is given any clue as to how this has happened. Gregor at first reckons that his transformation is temporary, but increasingly becomes less optimistic about his situation as the story progresses. Throughout the course of the story, Gregor is imprisoned in his room by his own family, who become more and more negligent and resentful of him. Without Gregor able to go out and work, the family is forced to find a way to sustain itself, a task which is not made any easier by having to care for Gregor. By the final chapter of the story, they have all but forgotten their love for Gregor and finally resolve to get rid of him. The story ends with Gregor dying of starvation in his own room and the family moving away to a smaller house, completely apathetic toward the death of Gregor and obsessed with their own futures and how they will manage themselves. Now, this tragic story is allegorical on many levels, and it could be taken as trying to convey many different messages, a condemnation of utilitarianism, materialism, etc. But one of the narrative's most distinguishing characteristics is its nihilistic premise. As already mentioned, nihilism is the belief that life has no meaning. You live when you live, you die when you die, and there is no rhyme or reason to it. Nothing that you do during the course of your life matters. The events in your life, or for that matter, your life itself, is all a product of blind chance and luck of the universal draw. The story of Gregor Samsa seems to reflect this cynical mindset. Without explanation, without reason, he finds himself living a life of alienation, imprisonment, and misery. Not even the reader ever finds out why this happens, it just does, and at the end of the day, all of Gregor's feelings, his thoughts, his despair, his anger, his sufferings are all completely irrelevant because he just dies alone, a meaningless end to a meaningless life, all without leaving any real legacy behind. His possessions are discarded, his room is used for storage, his very memory becomes lost, and no one, not even his own family, mourns him when he is dead. If that isn't a nihilistic worldview, then I don't know what is. Now, whether you agree or disagree with my assessment of Kafka's story, hopefully you should have a pretty good idea of how nihilism, at least in theory, can inform the setting, narrative arc, and outcome of a story. So how does this work in grimdark fantasy? Well, grimdark could honestly be considered somewhat nihilistic on several fronts, such as its glorification of violence and thematic darkness, but the way in which it is most obviously nihilistic is its treatment of morality. In a grimdark narrative, virtuous and altruistic behavior such as heroism, mercy, temperance, self-sacrifice are cast in an extremely negative light. Moral righteousness is portrayed as a foolish or even futile endeavor, and this is often reinforced within the context of the story. Heroes die horrible deaths, innocent righteous people are slaughtered by powerful invaders, harbingers of justice are relentlessly persecuted. Basically, anyone who acts as a moral agent is brutally silenced. In other words, the traditional view of an all-encompassing moral law is completely done done away with in a grimdark narrative. More often than not, protagonists are morally degenerate anti-heroes who function more as a means to an end of vanquishing an even greater evil than a force of actual righteousness. Sometimes the protagonists are just straight up evil themselves, killing to achieve their goals, serving corrupt leaders in exchange for wealth, ruining the lives of people less powerful than they are, things like that. So far I've talked about ways in which the characters and moral values are set up in a grimdark narrative, and vaguely hinted at ways in which they can pertain to the setting. But what about the setting itself? This brings us to the third distinguishing characteristic of grimdark fantasy, the dystopian setting. For those of you that don't know, dystopia is a word for a fictional or hypothetical world, the inhabitants of which lead horrendously dehumanized lives. In the case of a dystopian narrative, the setting typically features a tyrannical, totalitarian government which enslaves its own people by means of draconian laws. The very word dystopia is an antonym to the word utopia, which is basically a word for a hypothetical, perfect world in which the inhabitants live unimaginably peaceful, tranquil lives, and every negative aspect of human life, from violence and poverty to individual discomfort and dissatisfaction, are non-existent. Some famous examples of novels within the genre of dystopia include George Orwell's 1984, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, just to name a few. In the case of grimdark fantasy, dystopia serves mainly as a means of setting up the aforementioned degenerative moral values in the context of the story. You could almost think of the dystopian setting as the reason why the characters are the way they are. The more frightening and brutal the setting is, the more believable it is that the characters involved would be deceitful, self-serving scoundrels, and any truly moral characters would be a minority. But the question remains, how does one go about creating a dystopian setting, specifically one that flourishes in the context of a grimdark fantasy? To me, there are two main details that characterize a dystopian setting: the presence of an oppressive, authoritarian power structure, and the powerlessness of the protagonists and all of the relatable characters. To give you an idea of how this works, I'll use George Orwell's 1984 as an example. 1984 is a chilling story about a future totalitarian socialist regime that has so much power over its own people that it controls literally every aspect of their life, from what they eat and what they wear to what they can say and even think. The protagonist of the novel is a middle-aged man named Winston Smith, who is a member of the Socialist Party and whose occupation actually consists of falsifying records and rewriting details of history to make them coincide with the propaganda of the party. Throughout the story, we discover that Winston is actually conscious of the fact that the party is lying to him and to everyone else. He does not actually believe the figures they put out and the history lessons they give, but feels powerless to resist because of the immense strength of the party. He sees how most of the people he interacts with not only approve of, but in many cases fanatically worship the activities of the party. They all do blindly believe whatever the party tells them to believe, that the party makes life better and that the party keeps them safe. And so from Winston's perspective, he is the outsider. He is the thought criminal for believing otherwise. He feels like he is in the wrong, despite knowing for a fact that he is right. 1984 is the perfect example of how a dystopian story works, because it perfectly illustrates all of the details that make the idea of a dystopian world horrifying. There is a totalitarian government that wields absolute power. The main character is completely powerless to challenge it. The people are all living miserable lives. All of these things really help to immerse the reader in the world that Orwell is envisioning. While a grimdark story may not feature such futuristic details as those present in 1984, the way in which a dystopia works is not all that different from the Orwellian concept. For example, in a fantasy narrative, you might have a sadistic monarch as the antagonist rather than a tyrannical socialist party, but the end result is largely the same in both situations. In both cases, they serve as the catalyst for human evil, an oppressive force which serves as a setup for the suffering and consequently the moral degeneracy of the people within that society. In short, grimdark fantasy is a specific type of fantasy characterized by a hellish and inhumane dystopian setting, characters who lack any inclination to behave altruistically or ethically, multidimensional protagonists with prominent flaws and vices, and a general atmosphere of moral degeneracy and degradation. Oftentimes, the narrative itself expresses a message of cynicism and nihilism, in which any traditional morality is viewed as irrelevant, unimportant, or cast in a negative light. Basically, it is a type of fantasy which cultivates and basks in an atmosphere of total, brooding darkness. It is not only a form of fiction, but a method of storytelling that explores the dark side of human nature and evaluates it critically and interprets it pessimistically. Just think less Lord of the Rings and more The Witcher. Now, you may be wondering what it is exactly that sets Grimdark aside from other categories of fantasy. To go back to the example that I just used, what exactly is it that differentiates The Lord of the Rings from a narrative like The Witcher? This brings us to the distinction between high and low fantasy. You see, The Lord of the Rings, along with most Tolkien and Tolkien-style fantasy, is high fantasy. This means that the story itself possesses an air of predestination. In other words, it is more or less a given that goodness will triumph over evil in the end, and the source of adventure and mystery in the story are the details of how the quest will succeed. Basically, righteousness will prevail in the end, but the reader does not know how this will be accomplished, and so the meat of the story lies with the interest and fondness that you grow to have for the characters involved. If this seems odd to you, remember that Tolkien's worldview, and consequently his method of storytelling, was a Christian one, since Tolkien was pretty much the one who pioneered high fantasy, at least in the way that we have come to think of it today. We have to consider what his own beliefs and worldview consisted of. In Christianity, the religion is very much centered around the narrative of good versus evil. It teaches that although goodness will triumph at the end of all ages, it is the responsibility of the individual to ensure that salvation is attained. So even though it is a given that good will win, the individual characters, if you will, who are involved in the story, still operate freely and choose their own path. In many ways, high fantasy works a lot like this. In the case of low fantasy genres such as Grimdark, however, things operate quite differently. As already mentioned, because there really is no objective morality to speak of in this kind of fantasy, the flow of the overarching narrative itself is not predetermined, meaning that good may not necessarily win out over evil. And so the reader is not only enthralled by the agency of the characters in the story, but also the course of the narrative arc itself. In other words, you never know what you can expect, even more so than in the case of high fantasy. So now that we've gone over what Grimdark fantasy is, it's time to answer the question, how do you write it yourself? Well, in my opinion, the key to writing an immersive, engaging Grimdark narrative is establishing the atmosphere of your story. This can be done in numerous ways and in numerous aspects, from archaic architectural choices and other thematic elements to the choices and actions of the individual characters themselves. For example, Gothic architecture is commonly associated with darkness and mystery, in part due to the Bloodborne and Dark Souls video games, but also due to the fact that the word Gothic itself is a name for a genre of fiction that is thematically dark, specifically within the realm of Romanticism. Edgar Allan Poe is an example of an author that falls under this category. Cyclopean architecture similarly connotes a setting of ominousness and mystery, largely thanks to its prominence in the many works of dark fantasy and cosmic horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. Another way that you can incorporate a tone of darkness into your story while remaining true to the genre of fantasy is by utilizing monsters. In any kind of fantasy, monsters often play a key role in the unfolding of the narrative, from Beowulf's Grendel to Lord of the Rings' Shelob. Monsters serve as not only an interesting feature of the fictional world with which you are working, but they can often provide an interesting allegorical representation within the story. Perhaps the monsters in your narrative serve as an immediate threat but are also meant to represent something, the pain and sufferings of individual characters, the sickly, inhumane state of the world, or the dark side of human nature itself. Additionally, when creating your monsters, don't be afraid to try to create something new and unique. Don't just use the same old generic monster designs that have been done to death by various fantasy writers over the years. Try to amaze your reader by presenting him with something that he's never seen before, or at least wouldn't expect to see in a fantasy genre. Maybe you use the typical monsters of fantasy, trolls, orcs, dragons, etc., but you design them in such a way that they feel like a new take on the fantasy genre. Maybe you favor a kind of Lovecraftian aesthetic for your monsters and creatures, or maybe you feature more abstract, almost nebulous entities. Maybe you take a look into Old Nordic or Old English mythology and you revive a lesser known type of mythical monster. However, at the end of the day, these are all just things that appeal to and inspire me. In your story, you can do whatever you want. You are the sole creator of the world and the narrative. Now that you know the rules of Grimdark fantasy, don't forget to use them to your advantage and break them with style wherever you see fit. In the immortal words of Bob Ross, in your world, you make all of the decisions.